So Ayaan Hirsi Ali has a new book out called Heretic. So she's making the rounds recently, and some people have criticized her for some of the actions that she's taken. I agree with a lot of those criticisms, and in fact, recently online I called her a neocon maniac. A lot of people were very offended by this, including Sam Harris, and he pointed in his blog to an interview that he had done with Ali to dispel some of the myths surrounding her. I read the whole thing, and I was greatly amused. So let me break down both the interview and Ali, and in the end we will see if we've got evidence that she might in fact be a neocon. Now, in the interview, Sam Harris wanted to address a couple of points that people use against her. One is that she lied during her asylum proceedings when she was trying to get into the Netherlands. Okay, she did. She admits that now, and she admits it thoroughly in the interview. We'll get to whether that's important or not in a little bit. She also gets criticized for saying some comments about Breivik, who was a killer in Norway, killed 77 people. I'll judge that in a minute as well. She also gets criticized for being part of American Enterprise Institute, which is a neocon outfit, which is in favor of pretty much every war we've had in the Middle East and wars we could potentially have in the Middle East. It houses almost all the people who were the architects of the Iraq War. Okay, now in terms of the intellectual so-called firepower. Now, first of all, when I talked to Sam in our discussion, he spent about half an hour berating me on journalism. Let's quickly note how this interview went. Sam Harris, when asked about, or when talking about how she had lied in her application, says, quote, "I don't see how any serious person can hold this against you." Remember, he's doing the interviewing. And then on liberals not hiring her initially when she came to the U.S., he said, "I consider this one of the great moral scandals of our time." Doesn't appear to be a hardball interview at this point. He went on to ask, or say to her, "So the fact that liberals hold this affiliation against you is just shameful," referring to how she was working at the American Enterprise Institute. So far, not a lot of disagreement, not a lot of hard questions. Harris continues, "Let's turn to the subject of Islam in general. I doubt there's any daylight between us on the topic, but let's go into it in some detail." Seemed to be getting very hard. And at the very end, he says, "When I announced that I would be speaking with you this week, many people wrote to me asking how they can support you. I believe I can answer that question. They can donate to your foundation, and they could read your wonderful books." Look, somebody's doing an interview with you, you want to plug their books, no problem. People do that all the time in the media. I get it, right? You agree with her, no problem. But you brought her on to talk about these charges against her. And I read the whole thing. You did not ask one hard question. Everything was one softball after another. Oh, aren't your critics the most shameful people ever? Yes, they are. I totally agree. So there's not a lot of value that comes out of it. But what you do get out of the interview is a couple of classic examples of a straw man argument. Here's Harris saying, "It never ceases to amaze me that when one complains about Muslim theocrats abusing Muslim women and free thinkers, one inevitably gets accused of anti-Muslim bigotry." No, one doesn't. That's not what you get accused of anti-Muslim bigotry for. Nobody thinks, oh, that Muslim guy beating his wife, don't criticize him. No one's ever said that. No liberals ever said that. You can't find any examples of that, okay? That's not the issue. The issue is when you say, hey, some Muslims take wrong actions or violent actions, which certainly happens. So let's figure out what we should do about them. And people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali says, let's bomb them. Let's do a perpetual war against them. I'll get to those quotes in a little bit. That's what our problem is. Not that you've criticized some wrong actions by some Muslims. We all agree to that criticism. Here's a straw man by Hirsi Ali. She says, how can speaking out about these kinds of atrocities, referring specifically to Boko Haram, possibly be seen as an assault on Islam? But it isn't. No one ever says, how dare you speak out against Boko Haram? Everyone in America agrees we're all against Boko Haram. The most liberal people in the world against Boko Haram. No one's saying if you speak out against Boko Haram that you're being anti-Muslim. Total straw man argument. If you don't have a good argument, you just go to a strong man argument. All right, one last one from Hirsi Ali. In a way, she says, it's easier for Muslims and their friends on the left to go after people like me and you than it is to go after Boko Haram. Well, there's a tiny bit of truth in that. I don't live in Africa, so it's harder for me to fight against Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab. I don't live in Iraq or Syria. It's harder for me to fight against ISIS. But you guys are trying to affect U.S. policy where I do live. So we speak out as strongly as we possibly can. I did today about Al-Shabaab. We were one of the first shows ever to cover Boko Haram and tell you about their atrocities and how hideous they are. Their name means that Western education is sinful. I can't think of a worse name than that, okay? So we speak out against Boko Haram and do the best we can in fighting back against them. But we're also allowed to criticize you, especially because you affect U.S. policy a hell of a lot more than they do. Okay, now, I am also told over and over again that Sam Harris, Ali, Bill Maher, etc. do not generalize about Muslims. There's two interesting quotes out of this interview that I wanted to bring to your attention. Sam Harris, quote, "The faith," referring to Islam, "has no truly moderate wing." Well, if it has no moderate wing, it's all extreme. Kind of seems like he's generalizing about all of Islam. Okay. Now, you can say about Islam, about Muslims is different. Okay? I agree. I criticize Islam all the time. I think it's wrong. The question is, are you criticizing, in general, all Muslims, most Muslims, etc.? So here's another quote from Sam Harris in that same interview. "It remains the case that only the Muslim community reliably threatens its critics with violence, not just in the Middle East, but everywhere." Muslim community sounds like all or most Muslims. And on top of that, he adds a little cherry on top. They're the only ones who do it, and they do it everywhere. That seems like it's pretty broad, pretty general about Muslims, quote, everywhere. Okay, I know, I'm the crazy one. They never generalize. I'm sure I'm misinterpreting. Okay, now, on to the actual issues with Hirsi Ali. So she lied in her application for asylum. Honestly, I don't care. She made up her name. She said that she came directly from Somalia when she didn't, to escape the civil war. She wasn't in the middle of that. But she went through, according to her, some significant horrors. She had a forced marriage. One of my great aunts famously stood up to a forced marriage. I can relate and empathize with that. She says she went through female genital mutilation. Horrible, horrible. So you lied in your application. I don't care. I don't care at all. She wanted to get into a country where she'd be safe. No problem. Okay? Now, her comments about Breivik, the killer who wanted to kill people in Norway because he was afraid that Islam was spreading too much in Europe, those are interesting. Let's hear what she said first. This was back in 2012. She said, "Fourthly and finally, the one man who killed 77 people in Norway because he fears that Europe will be overrun by Islam may have cited the work of those who speak and write against political Islam in Europe and America, myself among them, but he does not say in his 1,500-page manifesto that it was these people who inspired him to kill. He says very clearly that it was the advocates of silence, because all outlets to express his views were censored. He says he had no other choice but to use violence." Now, I wouldn't have framed it that way. When someone kills 77 people and does a horrible act of terrorism, I wouldn't have made his argument for him by saying, well, I guess he said he had no choice but to do that violence. Now, if you did it when Boko Haram attacked someone, would she have come out and said, well, Boko Haram says they had no choice but to use violence? Okay, I wouldn't have framed it that way. But you know what? Overall, not that big a deal. She's not saying it. She's saying that he's saying it. And she's making it a part of a larger talk about it. I think it goes to her state of mind a little bit, but if you want to give her a complete pass on that, fine, no problem. Here's my real issue. She joined the American Enterprise Institute, that is the home of all the neocons who were in favor of the Iraq War and would like to invade Iran now. So apparently she's being smeared for that. But in an interview with Reason magazine, where they actually asked her real questions, they asked her about those affiliations. So if she's a liberal within that group, she could easily say it and say, I disagree with their foreign policy. Here's what happened instead. Reason magazine asked, do you see eye to eye with high-profile AEI hawks, such as former Bush speechwriter David Frum and former UN Ambassador John Bolton? Hirsi Ali. Most of the time, I do. For instance, I completely and utterly agree with John Bolton that talking to Iran is a sheer waste of time. Now, John Bolton is as much of a neocon as there has ever been. John Bolton thought that we should get rid of 10 floors of the United Nations. Too much talking, too much diplomacy. massively in favor of the Iraq war, would like to attack Iran now. She says, what is this? Completely and utterly agree with John Bolton on his Iran policy. My friend, you are not a liberal. You can call yourself many things, but you're not a liberal. In foreign policy, you are a neocon. There are no liberals who agree with John Bolton's Iran policy. So you're just simply wrong. Now, if you want to say you're a liberal in other regards, well, that's your business, and I'm not going to judge that. But in foreign policy, you are as aggressively militaristic as it comes. You're not convinced yet? Okay, now let's move on to what she says about Islam. Reason magazine asks her, do you think Islam could bring about similar social and political changes? She says, only if Islam is defeated. Now, this is beginning to be problematic, but if she means Islam as an idea, well, okay, I think that's an interesting point, and I would have that discussion, and I might even agree in part. But she doesn't mean that. Here's what she says. Don't you mean defeating radical Islam? She says, no, Islam, period. Once it's defeated, it can mutate into something peaceful. It's very difficult to even talk about peace now. They're not interested in peace. Islam, period. Wait, it's about to get worse. Reason follows up. We have to crush the world's 1.5 billion Muslims under our boot? In concrete terms, what does that mean, quote, defeat Islam? Here's Hirsi Ali. I think that we are at war with Islam, and there's no middle ground in wars. This is not an ideological war. This is not a war of ideas and principles. Reason very specifically asked her, wait, you don't mean crush them under our boot, do you? You don't mean all of Islam, do you? She said, yes, I do mean all of Islam. And yes, there is no middle ground in a war. It's a real war. One more. Hirsi Ali says, there comes a moment when you crush your enemy. Reason asks, militarily? Hirsi Ali says, in all forms. And if you don't do that, then you have to live with the consequence of being crushed. So anyone who tells you that Hirsi Ali is a liberal and doesn't actually believe in a military solution and is not really at war with Islam and only means it symbolically is lying to you. She doesn't mean it just symbolically. She means it literally. She is a neoconservative in foreign policy that believes the right answer is war, bombing, and that's why she works for the American Enterprise Institute. And they could point and say, oh, look at this former Muslim. And even she agrees, and she's a liberal. That's what they claim. She's a liberal, and even she agrees we must bomb the Muslims. That's exactly what they want. You served it on a platter to them. So don't come around here pretending that you're a liberal. You're no such thing. So don't pretend that you don't generalize about Muslims, because you do. Don't pretend that you're not in favor of war against Muslims, because you are. Now, that doesn't justify any attacks against her. We battle with ideas, never with force. We are progressives, and if you're a progressive, you believe in the battle of those ideas. We're not like the conservatives. We don't believe in using force and using bombings in the same ways that they do. We certainly don't believe it in a preemptive attack as we did in Iraq. We certainly don't believe it in general characterizations against certain ethnicities or groups. You want to fight against radical Islam? You want to do it in a real way, in an effective way? I'm right there with you. I'm ahead of you, okay? But if you want to start generalizing against all Muslims and start disastrous wars all over the Middle East, I am most certainly not with you, and you are not with us. You are not a progressive, so stop calling yourself that.